How is it time to get up already? I'm not getting up. I have to get up. I have to go to work. I don't want to go to work. I hate work. I could call off, but that means actually picking up the phone and talking to someone. It's easier if I just don't show up. But then they'll call, and that'll make me anxious because I'll have to ignore it because I didn't go to work and I have no logical reason why I didn't go to work, and I can't lose another job because I didn't show up. I can't pick this up. Fuck. I guess I'll just go to work.
There's nothing physically wrong with you.
Then why do I feel so awful, so bloated and sluggish? Nothing gives me joy anymore. Not the house, the car, the clothes, the raise. Nothing. Doctor, I'm frightened. Well, do something. Can't you give me a pill?
There's no pill for what's wrong with you. I'm afraid you're suffering from affluenza.
Oh, my God. Why me? Is it fatal?
It's catastrophic. It's the new epidemic.
Oh, there is a cure, isn't there?
Possibly.
And good evening. Of course, it's Monday evening, so it's Red Line TV. Now, last week was the first, in fact, of 3 programs where we're looking at, depending on what you feel comfortable with, is capitalism bad for our mental health, or is capitalism driving us crazy? Dr. Bob Gill gave us a really good context of what's happening now in terms of the treatment for people to support their mental health, and whether it's getting worse or not. And of course, what he seemed to imply was it's getting a lot worse. Exactly what we'd expect with the political and economic conditions that we find ourselves in. We also had a really interesting interview with Professor Chris Knight, where he was talking about what would be the ideal conditions to support the best mental health for human beings. The program got a bit lively at times, particularly when we discussed what the title should be and the way in which capitalist societies mitigate against human happiness. And of course, the discussion on mental health itself, what we mean by it, whether it's social, whether it's genetic, whether it's environmental, all of these things were quite interesting. Just a reminder here as well, please, we do need some financial support. So if you can, please support us via Patreon. But this week, we're focusing much more on the here and now. What is the relationship between capitalism, Marxism, and mental health? Why does the definition of mental health shift? Why does it change? How has psychiatry been politically weaponized? And what's the place of drugs in the maintenance of mental well-being? Well, to start with, we've got an interview with Ian Ferguson. Ian Ferguson's author of Politics and the Mind, Marxism and Mental Distress.
And have a lot of first-hand. Ian Ferguson is the author of a number of acclaimed books on the question of social work and the issue of mental health in capitalism and how Marxism is relevant to understanding those issues. Welcome, Ian. You are an active socialist and you have worked with a lot of people with mental health issues, problems, and have a lot of first-hand experience. And you've written openly about your own struggle with depression. Firstly, first question I'd like to ask you on the terminology, because this came up in our show last week. What do you think as an expert about the terms mental health and mental illness? Are they problematic because they imply that these are purely medical issues that can be treated by a doctor with a pill or talking therapy? Or should we instead reclaim terms like madness or crazy to show that it's actually chiefly society that is driving us mad?
Okay, it's a really important question. I'll start with saying the term mental illness reflects what has been the dominant view of mental health, mental distress for certainly over a century, at least. And it is the view, it's usually referred to as the medical model or the biomedical model, which is based on the notion that people become unwell primarily because there is some malfunction in their brains, okay? Now, more modern, more sophisticated versions of this model will also recognise what's usually called, quote, social factors or, quote, the environment, but these are secondary. The real problem is that some people, for genetic reasons, for biochemical reasons, or whatever, are more prone to conditions, whether it's conditions such as anxiety or depression, or conditions such as schizophrenia, or what is called schizophrenia, and so on and so forth. I think it's a very problematic model for a number of reasons. Probably the main one being that there's actually no evidence. Very, very little evidence. I'll qualify that a wee bit. Quite clearly, for example, our genes affect everything we do. Yeah, but there was a great expectation that the Human Genome Project, as that developed, that would show us, you know, the schizophrenic gene, the depressive gene, or whatever. I'm not going to use a lot of quotes in this meeting, but I'll just use one quote, right? This is from David Cooper, who was the chair of the body that put together a very important book, often referred to as a psychiatric Bible, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And he edited the latest edition. I mean, essentially, it's the book is a handbook which psychiatrists use. It lists all the diagnosis and recommends treatment and so on. And Cooper, writing in 2013, says, in the future, we hope to be able to identify disorders using biological and genetic markers that provide precise diagnosis that can deliver with complete reliability and validity. Yet this promise, which we have anticipated in the 1970s, remains disappointingly distant. We've been telling patients for decades that we're waiting for biomarkers. We're still waiting. So that's the first part of the problem with, and similarly, we can talk about, you know, there are chemical theories about lack of a particular neurotransmitter or whatever, but really the evidence for these is pretty non-existent. If the evidence for this is so weak, as you know, and I can come back and, you know, provide lots of research evidence, why does it persist so strongly? And I think really there's two reasons. One, a fairly obvious reason, is it's a very convenient one for the pharmaceutical industry, for big pharma. And so the result, as we now know, is that in Scotland, for example, something like 1 in 6 adults are on antidepressants, right? In the period of austerity from 2010 to 2020, the number of people on antidepressants doubled. So this makes vast sums of money for companies like Eli Lilly and Pfizer and so on. Again, we can talk about this, but the evidence for the effectiveness of most of these drugs is again very, very weak. Now, always necessarily a caveat here. Some people find antidepressants, for example, helpful. That's great. And certainly no one should come off these drugs without speaking to their GP. But for example, there was a recent review of the evidence, which actually argued for antidepressants, but which found, for example, that Prozac, which was hailed in the 90s as the miracle cure for depression, was actually one of the least effective antidepressants. But people took it because it's fewer side effects. So, but also it's a very, very convenient explanation for, if you like, for the ruling class. Was essentially what it does is it individualizes mental distress and basically says there's something wrong with individuals. And in fact, and we can maybe come on and talk about this, but there's now a huge body of evidence that shows that, unsurprisingly, factors of poverty, of class, of oppression, and also of early life experience, like trauma and so on, are really what are the main factors contributing to men. So to answer your question, I think the use of the phrase mental illness is problematic. What term we then use, people prefer different terms, Frank. There is the MAD movement, which some people like. I think it's great. I mean, I think the assertiveness of it is great. I think the problem is that there are lots of people who have suffered from mental distress who probably wouldn't want to call themselves mad. So there's no single term, but I do think mental illness is a problematic term.
Can you even distinguish, which ones are biological and which ones are not?
I think there are some useful distinctions. There are conditions which are quite clearly brain conditions. For example, Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or whatever. There are also conditions, where people, the use of drugs, the use of alcohol and so on, Korsakoff, psychosis, etc., where clearly organic damage is caused to the brain. So clearly there are epilepsy, another example, clearly organic, what we might call organic disorders. Classically, psychiatry distinguishes between these disorders and what they called functional psychosis, which they would include schizophrenia, manic depression, or bipolar disorder. And the reason I call them functional was because there was no evidence of any organic conditions. But I think one distinction is there are clearly conditions like that which require medical treatment, etc. So that's one lot. I think there are then what would now probably be called neurodiverse or neurodevelopmental conditions. Whether we call them conditions is another question, such as autism or whatever, but I think it would now be more correct to speak of neurodiversity. We're all different. One issue there is that if you look at the DSM-5 that I referred to, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, every single, quotes, condition in it has the term disorder after it, right? Now, I think many of us would argue that, for example, to be having panic attacks right now around COVID, around climate change, or not sleeping well at night, right, or to grieve for several months after bereavement, I would argue these are normal human responses, right? They're part of the human condition. So to label them as disorders, I think is not, it's actually incorrect, frankly. It medicalizes everything. And I think, people sometimes talk about the medicalization of everyday life, children having defiant oppositional disorder when they stand up to teachers or whatever. So I think that the genetic evidence, they found, 70, 80 genes that may in some way be linked to depression, but it's a tiny number. And I think the argument which comes from some of the leading critics in this field, that actually if we invested even a tiny amount of the money that's spent on genetic research and drugs into improving housing and improving people's benefits, that would make a much bigger difference. The biggest single indicator of mental distress is class. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. And that brings us neatly to the next question, which is, why it's so much worse under capitalism than it has before. I mean, I'm sure there's a reason that, there's issues like with, unless you know what it is, you can't diagnose it in a sense. So there might have been people suffering from things that didn't have a name. But Karl Marx, while he wasn't a psychologist or psychiatrist, he wrote at length about alienation in class society, and particularly about in capitalism, not in order actually to explain mental health problems, but to explain how capitalism divorces people from their work, from the products they produce, from other workers, but also from themselves and their human essence. Do you think that alienation, and capitalism has changed quite a lot since he wrote that, but do you think that this concept of alienation is still a useful concept to explain why there's quite so much unhappiness and depression in this system?
I think it's an extremely useful concept, and it's interesting you say it, because there's a lot of very, very good critical research material that's come out in recent years from critical psychologists, from service user groups. Interestingly, they don't make much reference to alienation. And I think one of the things I've tried to do in my own book is to highlight that. Essentially, I think, very, very crudely, essentially what Marx was saying is that capitalism is a society that is precisely not based on meeting human need, but it's about the pursuit of profit, accumulation for accumulation's sake. So therefore, on the one hand, it does not meet our basic physical needs. Otherwise, as we know very, very well, this winter, millions of people will have to choose between heating or eating, feeding their families or whatever. So, while millions are starving around the globe. So it doesn't meet our basic physical needs, but nor does it meet our psychological and emotional needs. And I think that that's a really core element. And essentially, what Marx was arguing, there is such our essence, if you like, what he calls our species being, is actually our capacity for development. Right? He uses, the fact that human beings are imaginative, creative animals, and that is precisely what capitalism stifles, does not allow us either to be ourselves, for example, in terms of sexuality or whatever, but also in terms of developing skills, talents, whatever. And the fact that we are not allowed to be who we are, and they're often, I think there's another important factor here, which is the use of shame, that people are often ashamed of what they feel or ashamed of what, again, I think it's something that crushes human potential. I mean,
when Marx wrote this, capitalism looked quite differently. It was actually the working class was pushed together into factories and could actually still organize to a degree. Today, capitalism is actually doing the opposite. It atomizes workers, especially in the West, where we work from home, we work by ourselves, we're isolated, which was made worse by COVID, etc.
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is even during the so-called the long boom, the kind of successful, the post-war capitalism, when living standards generally were improving, when the welfare state was being implemented and so on, even then, it has to be said, there were quite high levels of mental distress, right? So, for example, the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm wrote his book, The Sane Society, basically saying US society was not sane. That was in the 50s. And even then, class was important. But what's undoubtedly true is that the neoliberal model of capitalism, since the 80s and 90s, which is very much based precisely on atomization. Remember Thatcher's, there's no such thing as society, only individuals. The emphasis on competition from the nursery onwards. The increasing work, the intensification of work. All these things have undoubtedly affected people. Of course, they would affect people's health, physical and mental. The undermining of community, I think, has been a big feature. That's the downside. Linked to that, and I quote this in the book, there's a very, very interesting study by a journalist which correlates very closely the relationship between the decline of class struggle in the 90s in this century and the rise of mental distress, right? Because as collectively are unable to resist, right? Then in that situation, people are much more likely to internalize the pressures of the boss and of the workplace and so on and so forth. So there's a very interesting correlation there between a low level of industrial struggle, a higher level of mental distress. But the good news is, right, I think the converse is also true, right? That basically where we see workers collectively fighting back, where people are out on picket lines, have some sense of their collective strength, and then actually they feel better about themselves. Now, I'm not being silly. I'm not saying that the answer is to get everyone's got a mental health problem on their picket line, although it might not be a bad idea. But certainly it's also true, and we all know this, and again, I mentioned this in the book, when people are feeling very down, very depressed, or very anxious, they are not going to feel in a very strong position to fight back. So that's fairly obvious. But I do think that there is a link between, there's a famous, if apocryphal story, when the trade unions were rising in Poland in the early 80s, when Solidarność was on the rise, the psychiatric hospital was emptied of workers and filled up with the old Communist Party bureaucrats, because the workers actually wanted to be part of the struggle. I think that one of the most encouraging things from a mental health point of view is the fact that what we're seeing at present in Britain and other countries is a growing level of resistance. That sense of agency. And I think agency is and we could discuss this in more length, but I think agency is a crucial factor. A lot of mental distress, whether it's depression, whether it's what's called, whether it's hearing voice or whatever, is often about feeling that you're not in control of yourself. You're dominated by difficult feelings, or you're dominated by voices or whatever. And the nice thing about, for example, the hearing voices networks is precisely that they give people a relationship with their voices, some sense of control over their voices. And I think the same thing is true, that when we act collectively to challenge oppression, then I think we feel better about ourselves. The day-to-day stress of not knowing whether you will be able to feed your children, not to mention the nutritional effect of all these things, right? But I think that way, I think to me, chronic stress means not seeing any light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that has both physical and mental. And we know, for example, from the work of Wilkinson and Pickett and others, the impact not just of poverty, but of inequality, because that chronic stress is against a background where people watch their tellies and see the rich getting richer and see all the consumerist stuff that's going on. And people not able to see, I think maybe this is a crucial point, not able to see a collective way out.
And that the ideology of meritocracy individualizes poverty as well, that this is down to your own failures or an absence of effort and talent on your part.
To put it very, very simply, I remember doing some research some years ago. A doctor who had worked in the homeless field with people with this so-called diagnosis for a long time. And I quote this in the book. He says, in all the time I've been working here, I have never met anyone who had what you might call a normal upbringing. Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean that you can have a so-called normal upbringing and still not experience mental health problems. But the likelihood is, if as a child, it's actually quite basic. If you have been loved, right? If your physical and emotional and social needs have been addressed to a good enough extent, then you are less likely. Now, that said, of course, there is then, if you are Black, then you're much more likely to, no matter how loving your family may be, you're likely to experience racism. If you're gay or trans or whatever, you're going to experience all kinds of discrimination. And again, I mean, just to throw in another figure, but the fact that Afro-Caribbean males are far more likely to be diagnosed as schizophrenic, are far more likely to be sectioned, are more likely to be tasered, are more likely to be given ECT is not something in their brains. If it was, we would expect the same experience of Afro-Caribbean people living in Jamaica or Trinidad or whatever, and it's not, right? So essentially, it's about being, I think, treated as the other. That is bound, I think, to have an enormous impact on the way you see yourself.
What do we say to those currently in distress? We can't tell people to wait for socialism, can we? We can't say we put off addressing your mental health problems until such time as we've got a society that is compatible with your species' essence.
The difficulty is that because mental health is not a priority for government, right? Then the reality is that for most people are left to struggle alone. For many people, therefore, the first port of call will normally be their GP. And you know, for some people that may be very, very helpful, and that's terrific if they have a GP. I think, you know, to be fair to GPs and psychiatrists, I think a lot of them would love to have more time to listen to people. But often very, 10-minute slots, 15-minute slots, or whatever, and often that means that the only thing available will be a pill. Elsewhere, if people are able to prescribe counselling, again, it's important that there's choice. But in reality, it will often mean 6 or 8 weeks of cognitive behavioural therapy, which may or may not be very, very helpful in terms of exploring why they feel like this. The difficulty is actually there's lots and lots of good evidence of what does help. Some of us did a research a few years ago into a social crisis centre in Midlothian, which was where people could come and simply talk either to other people who were experiencing distress or to some of the workers there or whatever. And we actually called the report someone to talk to, because that's what people found was useful. There was a very, very good centre in Glasgow until a number of years ago called the Charlie Reid Centre, which was a cafe, which was run by people with mental health problems. Really, there was hundreds of people used it. It was closed down because of budget cuts. Right. So the reality of the situation, Mike, is that resources have been cut back. As we know, there are very long waiting lists for all kinds of services, which I think is criminal, particularly as it affects young people. It's absolutely criminal. Responses developed, say, by people who hear voices. There's the Hearing Voices networks, which I think are very promising. There are other approaches that have been developed. They don't rely on medication, but they require proper funding. And the reality is, as only last week, the Scottish Government announced, John Swinney announced major cuts to mental health funding. Like one of the few positive developments, I think, over the past couple of decades or so, and has been the development of the mental health service user movement. Right. And I think they have often come up with strategies and responses which they find helpful. Right. And I think I actually listen to them. That all said, quite clearly, we need to address the root causes. Right. And, which include, crap housing, poor, very work-related stress, lack of money, all these things, which it's not surprising that we're seeing such a huge increase, I think, in the number of people who are experiencing whether depression, anxiety, or whatever. It is a completely normal response to the massive pressure, and plus climate change, plus everything else. I suppose the logical conclusion of what I'm saying is that in any society, whatever kind of society, people will still suffer loss, bereavement, etc., etc. But I think what all the research shows and everything shows that in a society that was based on meeting human need and not in profit, in other words, I think a socialist society, levels of mental distress would be much, much lower.
That was Ian Ferguson, who's written a good book. I've put the title in the chat. So if comrades want to get that book, I think it would be, it's a really good investment. It's called Politics of the Mind, Marxism and Mental Distress. We're now joined by Ian Spencer. Welcome, Ian. He's a nurse and health researcher with a special interest in mental health. And sorry, just a second, just unmute you. We want to discuss with him some of the issues that are arising from the interview with Ian Ferguson, and to discuss some things going beyond that. Ian, like the other Ian Ferguson, you are a Marxist and you have studied psychiatry. Ian Ferguson explained in this interview that in his view, there's almost no evidence that genes are responsible for most mental health problems. I think you have a slightly different view on that.
Just a bit. First of all, thank you for inviting me along. I thoroughly enjoyed Ian's presentation, and I don't have any significant disagreements with him. And for the record, I've ordered his book. The only reason why I take issue with it a little bit is that we don't need to be afraid of the results of good science. And it seems to me that things have moved along a little bit. The whole area of epigenetics is opening up whole new possibilities and better ways of understanding the interrelationship between genes and environment. The idea, for example, that if you like, because we haven't found the schizophrenia gene, that doesn't mean to say there's any genetic links. Well, we know there are genetic links to schizophrenia. There's ample evidence that takes other forms. But epigenetics is different. You can start to see the way in which of the 25,000 genes that the humans have, some will be expressed and others not. And it's environmental factors that will decide whether they're expressed or not. And one of the fascinating things about it is not only can a gene be expressed or otherwise, so you might have a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia, but it's not expressed because of a whole range of protective factors. But you can also have situations where genes which have been changed, it's not that the gene is changed, it's that the expression of the gene is changed, can actually be inherited. So you can actually get situations where, let's say we know, for example, there is a powerful relationship between childhood trauma and subsequent emotional problems. And you can see the way in which epigenetics means that things can be passed on. So, for example, let's give you one simple example that's not related to psychiatry. Women who were starving in Holland between 1944 and 1945 are more likely to have had children who were likely to be overweight and have type 2 diabetes. This makes perfect sense from an evolutionary point of view. If you are born to a woman who has been starving, epigenetically, it's useful to have been changed so that you lay down fat, because you're going to need that if you come to be starving. And it doesn't take too much imagination to see how that can be somebody who's been brutalized, even if they're the children of somebody who's been brutalized, may well have epigenetic changes. The other thing in Ian's presentation that he hasn't really taken into account, I think, is some of the changes which have taken place in terms of medical imaging. So MRI scans, PET scans, that's positron emission tomography scans, have shown significant differences. I just want to cite one writer, James Fallon. James Fallon wrote a book called The Psychopath Inside. And yes, I think language matters, and I wouldn't use the term psychopath. I think he does it for dramatic effect, if you like. James Fallon is a highly respected neurophysiologist in the United States. And his party trick was to have a pile of brain scans and be able to go through them and say, psychopath, not psychopath, psychopath, not psychopath. And as a kind of wild card, he threw in some other kind of scans that he wasn't expecting. He had no particular views about, including his own. And guess where his came out? In the psychopath pile. Now that's interesting for all sorts of reasons. Firstly, you can actually discern changes to the brain, physical changes to the material substrate of the brain in people who have been traumatized and have attracted the diagnosis of personality disorder. In the past, well, it's certainly the case, having been a nurse in the care of people with personality disorders, it's a horribly stigmatizing disease. People treat it as if it's just behaving badly, just nasty people. I've heard qualified personnel say, oh, they're just horrible people. They're not just horrible people. These are people whose circumstances have physically damaged them. And you can see it on a PET scan. You can see the bits of the brain that would otherwise be responsible for things like conscience, damaged by their experience. Now, the other thing about Fallon's party trick was that, of course, he wasn't in prison. He wasn't in a psychiatric hospital. He was a highly respected neuroscientist. And so you can start to see how, yes, not only is there an interrelationship between genetics, epigenetics, and environment, but you can also see how In his case, having grown up in a comfortable background, he wasn't in prison. He wasn't in a psychiatric hospital, but could develop his full potential. And that's what Marxism is about. It's about people developing their full potential. We know there's a class gradient in almost all conditions. I don't draw a distinction between physical and mental conditions. Why would there be? As a consistent materialist, I don't believe there's a substance over there called mind and there's another substance over there called matter. Mind events are brain events, and if we're consistent materialists, I can't see any basis for denying the reality of psychiatric disorders. I've never met a schizophrenic yet who was having a good time. They weren't having some kind of heightened awareness of something. They seem to be having an awful time of it, and along with many of the people who are cared for with personality disorders.
Yeah, can I ask you about this example you mentioned? The starving women and their children become overweight. I mean, is that really a genetic thing? Is that not perhaps the women feeding their children more? How do you distinguish even between something like that being a genetic reason or being a environmental?
As I understand it, the studies of the Dutch hunger winter were important in that respect, because they showed that there weren't any genetic changes as such. It wasn't so much that the children were being fed more and therefore became fat. It was that they were more likely to deposit fat in a particular way. And this is true, and we see a class gradient in fatness, if you will. Working class people get fat in a different way. You're much more likely to deposit fat around internal organs and consequently develop type 2 diabetes.
Does that not be different types of food? Fast food?
Well, it's interesting because there are studies around that as well. The best one was from the 1950s in Roseto, Pennsylvania, where the population of Roseto, Pennsylvania lived on average 10 years longer than the surrounding population, notwithstanding the fact that they were poorer. Now, how are we to explain this? We're used to the idea that being poor kills us sooner. But here the people of Roseto, Pennsylvania were living longer, and yet they were poor. How do we explain this? Well, one example was people say, well, these are poor Italian immigrants, so they're eating olive oil and a Mediterranean diet. And they cooked everything in lard. They were poor. They had a higher fat content, if anything, than the surrounding population. What seemed to be a highly protective factor was community. There wasn't a huge social spectrum in Roseto. Most people were poor. Most of the men worked in the slate quarries. And it was a highly cohesive society where people helped one another out. It's one of those interesting features that we see in the sociology of health and illness, whatever disorder we're talking about, is that hierarchically flat societies appear to be healthy. And we've seen that, of course, with Pickett and Wilkinson. We've seen in the Whitehall studies of civil servants that one of the biggest social determinants is civil service rank. And where you get a sharp class gradient, that's enormously stressful. The inequality exerts an influence which is damaging over and above mere poverty, which is kind of scary, isn't it? I mean, so the United States, richest country in the world, spends more money on medicine than any other country in the world, has worse health outcomes than developing countries. Epigenetics is nothing new in it, but it's a hugely developing field, and it's a very important one. And James Fallon's case is also an interesting one, where you look at medical imaging. The point I'm trying to say really is that psychiatric disorders or mental health disorders, call them what you will, I think it's worth taking them seriously as illness, rather than what's the alternative to medicalization? Moralization? I mean, post-traumatic stress disorder came into being so that men brutalized by the Vietnam War could get help from the Veterans Administration. So it entered the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, post-traumatic stress disorder.
It's interesting, the idea, which is of course the Marxist idea, that the base gives rise to its own superstructure. Each mode of production gives rise to its own code, laws, psychiatry as well, presumably also in a dialectical relationship. And Absolutely. You have researched psychiatry in the USSR. So were there different kinds of mental health problems under Stalinism, say, than there are under capitalism?
There was worse health in general. Generally speaking, men in Russia lived about 10 years less than in more affluent Western countries. There were particular problems with alcohol. There were particular problems with a wide range of different disorders. But the Soviet example, the reason why I took up studying Soviet psychiatry was firstly because people tried to extrapolate from the well-documented political abuse of psychiatry in the USSR and say, well, there, look, that just shows you that this is what happens in the West too. Well, no, it doesn't. You can argue quite rightly that psychiatry in the West individualizes and pathologizes distress and illness. And all of that's true. And of course, that has an important ideological and political content. But there are few cases that I can find where the state has explicitly tried to bang somebody up in a psychiatric hospital. But that was a well-documented feature of a particular period in the Soviet Union. There was no political abuse of psychiatry under Lenin. There was no psychiatry. There were hardly any psychiatrists. There were hardly any psychiatric hospitals. And it would have been unthinkable anyway. There was no psychiatric abuse under Stalin. Why the hell would he? Beria would just have you killed. Why would they bother with psychiatry? And
which period were you looking at? Which period were you looking at?
So really, the political abuse of psychiatry comes into being after the death of Stalin, as if you like, as an ameliorated form of the labor camp. Once you've decided you're not going to just lock up intellectuals and what have you, then you've got to do something else. And the psychiatry wasn't really used to keep the working class quiet. They'd just be shot or sent to the gulags in the time-honoured fashion.
Ian, can I just ask you something? Because, I wrote a memoir called Pilgrim State, which was after the, well-known psychiatric hospital in New York State, Pilgrim State Hospital, where my mother was hospitalized for some time. And from the research I did in terms of what was happening during McCarthyism, there were quite a lot of people who were being put into psychiatric hospitals because of their political activities. Certainly from everything I found out about my mother, that was happening to her.
Well, that's interesting, and I'm not disagreeing with you. I wouldn't contradict you at all. You've studied it, I haven't. But what I'm saying is that I didn't find it as a general feature of psychiatric practice. The only person I ever knew who was political, who'd been locked up in a psychiatric hospital, was a member of the National Front who used to attack black people when he became psychotic. I think there are well-documented other examples. Siegfried Sassoon was put in a psychiatric facility. Well, it was a spa that had turned into a treatment centre for officers with shell shock, and he was put there because of coming up with the frankly ludicrous idea that slaughtering people on an industrial scale in the First World War wasn't such a great idea. The American poet Ezra Pound was put in a psychiatric hospital probably because he would otherwise have been executed for treason. Under Stalin, psychiatrists probably played a heroic role. I came across examples where people who would otherwise have ended up in front of a firing squad got carted off to the Serbsky Institute of Forensic Psychiatry, where I did my fieldwork, and they were basically, it was a case of citizen so-and-so has told a joke about Stalin. He's clearly unwell, and we'll treat him. And after he'd languished in hospital for a few months, he might be discharged as cured. So, under Stalin, when actually most doctors had no reason to support the regime at all, they probably saved lives. Later, of course, what happened by the time you get to Brezhnev and Khrushchev and then Brezhnev, of a whole generation of Soviet scientists, not just in psychiatry, but elsewhere, that owed their position to the state. They owed their position, the head of the Serbsky Institute of Forensic Psychiatry was a full colonel in the KGB. He owed his position to his loyalty to the regime, and this was true, quack scientists like Trofim Lysenko or whoever else who built their careers by denouncing other people, and built their careers on the backs of people they denounced.
One last question, perhaps, on the role of. Sorry, we have to rush a little bit along. We've got 2 more people to interview after this, which is the sort of the role of ideology in leading to mental health problems, which I find quite interesting. There's some obvious links. Obviously, you need, in capitalism, you need to have to go to work, and you're not finding fulfillment in work. It's just you have to go for 9 hours a day, etc. What I find quite interesting is issues like climate change, where a lot of young people are suffering. Clearly, the idea that in 100 years there could be no planet left, or even less than that, etc. The ideology of capitalism is green. It wants to save the planet. It's doing the carbon footprinting, blah, blah, blah. But very clearly, capitalism as a system is actually based on the opposite of saving the planet. It needs to expand. It needs to make a profit. Is this where sort of the role of ideology could be challenged, could become interesting from our point of view? How do you see that?
Absolutely. I mean, the medicine, science, or medicine and all other science, whether it's climate science or anything else. We saw it during the COVID pandemic, the scientists queuing up to be the official scientist or whatever, and certainly not necessarily challenging what the politicians were saying. You're absolutely right. I mean, I think what climate change has demonstrated is that capitalism is killing us all. I mean, at one time, the old saying that there was, only 2 possibilities: socialism or barbarism, is starting to look now, as Ivan Meszaros used to put it, we'll get barbarism if we're lucky. If something isn't done, and I think this is one of the things that's hugely attractive to young people as well. They can see that there's no such thing as a green capitalism. This is absurd. It's naked greed. And we now live in a time of open class struggle. And although it might seem as though there are more practicing witches than there are Marxists, it's still the case that the Marxists are the only people coming up with any kind of sensible arguments, so long as they are, of course, sensible Marxists, and not excessively dogmatic. So ideology is crucial for understanding. Medicine, psychology, all science is shaped by the environment. A genuinely socialist society would give us a genuinely scientific psychiatry, a genuinely scientific way of understanding how our brains develop and can be helped. The tantalizing beauty of the idea of epigenetics and the fact that experience actually shapes the substrate of the brain is it opens up the possibility that it could be changed. People could actually be helped. I've never known anybody with a personality disorder who's having fun. No.
Very interesting interview. Thank you very much, Ian, for educating us on epigenetics.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Over to Mike now, who is going to introduce 2 more speakers to us.
Thank you, Tina. And hopefully Dougie is with us, but we've certainly got Jane for the moment. I think Dougie was struggling a wee bit with his...
There he is.
There he is. Good man, you've made it, Dougie. Welcome, comrades. So let me just introduce you to the audience tonight. Jane is a clinical psychologist with many, many years in the field, working alongside drug users in some of Edinburgh's most deprived communities. And Dougie is active in the Labour campaign for drug policy reform and is a thorn in the side of Holyrood MSPs and continually lobbying for drug reform and radical drug reform. So, comrades, we've touched on it last week and this week, the very lucrative trade in poor mental health that Big Pharma exploits. But we've also touched on, to a degree, the illegal drugs market. What kind of illnesses, in your experience, are associated with people, if there are forms of mental distress associated with people who seek out the illegal drugs market for relief?
Okay, well, I need to break that question down a bit. The illegal drug markets, we're talking about a range of drugs that we don't often speak about as mood altering. They alter the way you feel. Now, the narrative is they're bad and dangerous, and that's why they're illegal. And you'll know the difference between the disinhibition of 2 pints and the oblivion of 10 pints if you're into the legal drug. But all those illegal drugs are mood altering. My expertise is in the subsection of the addiction field, and it is about childhood trauma, the legacy, adult mental health, and addiction. So some of the epigenetics I don't understand, but the blow up in neurosciences and the interaction, the dialectical interplay, biopsychosocial, cannot be broken into the way it is separated in our society now. So since Thatcher came in, when we talk about parenting and why these children have developmental trauma, because it's as children they're developing and they don't get whole, they're not glued together because their parents, the financial stress coming now is going to have a physiological impact on their kids. And we'll get to ADHD under complex PTSD, which is what earlier speakers were talking about with extreme stress. We now, firstly, if you were addicted, it was because you then got depression and anxiety. I then learned, as we shifted from basic drug awareness, uppers, downers, twisters, and benders, the field moved to dual diagnosis. Even when we clean you up in rehab, you've got this thing, addiction to illegal mood-altering drugs, usually heroin, and I'll say why, because childhood trauma, and what was the other one? Mood-altering drugs. Anyway, so the childhood trauma has been spoken before. My kids would say, you go home one day, there's nobody there, but there's nothing in the fridge. Next day, it's holy hell and you're all going to get to do it. Next day, you got 2 social workers going to dump you in a shit house and da-da-da-da-da. This is their life. It's chaos. It's the front line. It's hypervigilant, hypersensitive. So when you say what drug is associated with mood-altering legal drug use, why are the opiates the best? They kill physical and emotional pain. So what's the definition of addiction? It's much broader than drugs, which are problematized. It is a behavior that gives short-term gain, relief, pleasure, but long-term negative consequences. So if you need knee replacement because you're over jogging, you're addicted to the endorphins. But in the drug field, what we talk about now is self-medication, is the way in which growing up without a full self and having to live in an unsafe, crazy world because it's capitalist and it's toxic, and your parents have been toxified over 40 years. So your role models aren't there. You ain't got it. You ain't whole. You don't make it. You hit school at 5. What also goes, we now know with complex PTAT, is ADHD. These kids who get Risperdal, which is amphetamine, hit school at 5. They already had the childhood. They're toughened up. They're in special classes. They're in and out. You get the history. So what happens is it's not about bad choices. Nobody wants to become a drug addict. I don't ask what's the addiction. Why are you using? What was your childhood like? Who was there for you when you needed safety? Who said they loved you? And then you get unpacked. It's now, we know 90% have had difficult, painful childhoods, whether it's a mom who's just working too much and ain't there for the emotional what you need, to the extreme end. And the way we demonize this population suits, if your addiction is workaholism, IT, or consumerism, that's okay. But addictions that are drug-related are demonized.
Can I ask Jane, because you worked in the field, as I said in the introduction, for many, many years. Both Ians were correlating the decline in class consciousness and class solidarity, and the kind of cohesion of working class communities with an increase in poor mental health. Did you over that period see an additional trend in increasing drug use over that period?
Mark my words, I do science. You're going to see a massive increase in alcoholism and drug addiction over the next couple of years, let me tell you. What was that question again?
It's just whether both Ians, and we've spoken about it in the show over time, have identified a growing problem with mental health.
Okay, I remember. Early dementia. Yes, increasingly, I've noticed. I was in Berkeley, my first internship, sex industry workers, and I worked with the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, and they were given appropriate doses of methadone. Hit Mulehouse in the 80s, forget it. 90s, I worked nationally teaching, and then in Europe, got trauma added to the schedule. All 10 countries, their kids were covered with childhood abuse, and they were addicted to opiates. Now it's benzos. I'll let Dougie talk about that. But increasingly, we see, as I said, since Thatcher, the crippling of the family. Oh yeah, hunter-gatherers, community, we develop relationally. We don't pop out whole. We develop in relation to our environment and our community. And in hunter-gatherers, whether you're mentally ill or an elder or a kid, you have relational connection, which you don't get. And Marx got it. And in the last 40 years with Hayek and Thatcher running in, we got it in spades. And I have seen the increase in mental illness and the expansion, and then get into the addiction industry. Boy, that's another, or stock market with cannabis, but that's for another whole discussion.
Well, let me bring Dougie in at that point, Jane. Thank you. We've been talking about Dougie, big pharma, as well as and just now the illegal drugs market. In your experience, is there an overlap between state-sanctioned drugs and the illegal drug market? Do you see a lot of mixing of the drugs that are available from both the official and unofficial markets?
Oh, yes. And you've got to understand something. The international drug cartels could not fossil fuels out of money.
Sorry, Jane, that was to Dougie, that question.
Oh, sorry, Dougie, you take that one.
All right, Jane. Jane lives in Edinburgh, so do I. So hi, Jane, wherever you are. Let me just do 2 minutes to deal with some of what's been said. There was talk here there about childhood trauma. I had an experience, 25 years ago in London, where I don't know why I decided to go to a Freudian psychiatrist. Black beard, hat, everything, got me lying on the couch, was standing behind me. And to cut a long story short, he wanted to know about my birth trauma. He came from the view and was quoting Freud all the time. He kept telling me he was a Marxist, and he wanted to know about my birth trauma. I said, well, I don't really have that sort of relationship with my mother, but I'll find out for you. Found out it was 4 steps, went back, and he told me, there is no help for you. Come off all your antidepressants, come off everything. You'll never be happy because you were dragged into this whole streaming. Now, I don't know how true that is to Freud, but it was. I have a personal diagnosis of rapid cycling bipolar disorder and a generalized anxiety disorder. I take antidepressants, mood stabilizers, diazepam, and hypnotics. So, that's just a fact, just a bit about it. In relation to capitalism and the drug situation, let me just give you a couple of figures, a few figures, okay? This is the global drug economy from recognized research. Global cigarette and tobacco manufacturing in the world is a market of 684 billion, and that is coming from legal sources. Global beer legal manufacturing, 208 billion. Coffee, 18 billion. The illegal global drugs trade, and they specifically mentioned cannabis, cocaine-based products, opiates, amphetamine-type substances, 426 billion pounds. And the one above that is, not surprisingly, global pharmaceutical and medicine manufacturing, 1.2 trillion. My particular interest is in drug policy reform. The war on drugs doesn't work, which I'm sure you've all heard about. It's only recently I've been thinking too, though, about if we get my nirvana, which is legally regulate all drugs, that is all drugs. When I'm in these discussions, quite often people say, yeah, let's do that, and let's sell it in Boots, let's sell it whatever, and let's let big pharma manufacture it. So I'm not sure how useful that would be. I'm a huge fan of the cooperative movement, and I don't know if we could bring that model into that market, but given it's the size it is, 600 billion, that might not be possible.
One last question, folks, and it's a contentious area, I guess. Do some illegal drugs, despite, and let's have no illusions about the illegal drugs market, it destroys lives, it destroys communities, but do some illegal drugs potentially provide real and legitimate remedies to people's mental health?
Yes. The psychedelic field has exploded with research. They are microdosing with MDMA, which in the 70s was legal in California. Therapists used it in therapy. When it got to the street, they are microdosing with MDMA for complex PTSD. There is hope out there. Yes.
Can I just
go on, Dougie? You know,
two things. Another interest I have is in psilocybin being used for mental health alleviation, particularly in the field of the menopause. HRT is not proven. Well, it's proven to work, but it's 25 years been around. The long-term effect of HRT isn't known. The long-term effect of psilocybin has been around for 2 million years, and it is known. Back to capitalism very briefly, another interest I have is in the Amazon forest and the amount of tree felling and damage to that environment through illegal cocaine farming. But what is happening is some of that's being displaced, and you're getting big agriculture going in and replacing it. So sometimes, be careful what you wish for.
Thank you, both of you. I can see a field of yellow hands in the air and people want to come in. So stay with us, comrades. It may be that you can respond to some of the questions that are going to be asked, but thank you in the meantime.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, I can see already Ian wants to come back in, and that would be interesting to hear from him again. If you could unmute. Oh. You're still muted, I'm afraid. I'll press it again. It worked before. Sorry, Ian Spencer, I mean, yeah. I'll bring in Marion. You've got it, hello.
Yeah, just a tiny little thing. I mean, I've seen all sorts of promising, interesting things about psilocybin or whatever having some, promising effects with depression. Just be a little bit cautious. I mean, Sigmund Freud's early work was replete with learned articles saying how wonderful cocaine was and how it offered the possibility of a real treatment for the future. It doesn't mean to say that psilocybin isn't going to be helpful, or ketamine or whatever else, but that's all.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Marion, if you could unmute, I think your video is still not working, is it?
No, unfortunately, I haven't managed to suss out what's wrong with it. But I think this is a really important discussion. And like with the rest of the disability movement, I think the social model is more important than the medical model. Although obviously there is an interrelationship between them all. And I think sometimes the problem is we try and put things in boxes and we then don't join up again. So I think we need to be much more dialectical in our thinking. And I think it's really important that the lack of resource in the mental health side of things is absolutely criminal, in my opinion. The amount of suffering there is out there due to, well, obviously the capitalist society we live in, that goes without saying, is causing a lot of this. But the question is, how do we try and make it better for people in this situation? And I know as a carer, when my son was really poorly at one time, They didn't want to put him into a hospital. They thought it would be better for him to be in some kind of respite. What they had to do, they had to move around everybody so that he could go somewhere. And there's a total lack of beds, of resources. In Birmingham now, Birmingham Mind do a lot of what would have been previously be done in the NHS, because unless you're absolutely acute, there's no support out there at all. And we need to be looking at that side of things as well, because obviously I'm a Marxist, I'm a socialist, I'm fighting for a better world. But that also means we have to look at what kind of things can we do. And it is also a part of our fight and our struggle to change the world anyway. And for me, it's really important that we look at ourselves sometimes as well, because one thing I have noticed is the fact that sometimes if somebody speaks different or communicates in a slightly different way, people laugh at them and try and belittle them. I know sometimes that might be a reaction, but we need to think as well, what impact do we have when we treat people like that? And we've got to accept that everybody is different and people express themselves differently. So I think, we've got a lot of work to do as well. But the main thing for me is, how do we fight to improve the conditions for people? And I think, I'm not an expert, but I do think sometimes medicines in certain situations can help that situation. Sometimes drugs are needed, but it's a complicated thing, because I think obviously there's abuse as well. And, I also know that under the capitalists, the people in the drug manufacturers make a lot of money out of it as well. But we need to be aware of everything that's going on, and the total lack of resource on the mental health side of things is a big problem. I also think we need to do a lot more training and education on things like this, and understanding, people communicate. And the other big thing is, if somebody's got a learning disability, the lack of proper understanding and resource to enable them to play a better part and to develop themselves is not there as well. So there's a lot of work we need to be doing. But I definitely think we have to fight all the time for the social model, because that's what will empower people to get more control over their lives anyway.
Yeah. Thank you, Marion. Mia has a question. If you could unmute, please. She also has a problem with her camera.
Basically, I've always found that people have used mental health to discredit my lived experience, and I think that often happens. Basically, their thinking is they're not interested in fixing my environment, they're interested in fixing me, and basically suggesting I change my attitude to, and they tend to want to put a positive spin on things, like, oh, if you just look at it a different way, and it's like, if you just look at your oppression a different way. I mean, I'm like, as I said in the comments, when I was 17, my grandmother died, and I found her gasping for breath in the final minutes of her life. And everybody, like, I was put on fluoxetine because I was struggling to cope with that. And also, I'm an autistic trans woman, but I was raised as a neurotypical male, and few people have sort of recognized that actually maybe that mismatch has something to do with my mental health issues. And I was subjected to a 10-year hate campaign because I tried to advocate for my needs so I could access air travel. I was wanting reasonable adjustments. And basically, a lot of people conflated my activism with terrorism. and I ended up internalizing a lot of that. But the medical model narrative is that I sort of let those things affect me. Like if I'd been a stronger person, I wouldn't have let it affect me. And a lot of people were suggesting I took CBT, but I always knew that that wasn't the right approach for me, because it wasn't that I was a deficient person. It was that the things that were happening to me and the alienation and exclusion was what was causing my mental health issues. I mean, over the past couple of years, despite having had a traumatic experience, the sense of community I have has helped me through that. And just this afternoon, I got the news that a paper I submitted is going to be published in the British Journal of Social Work. And just hearing that sort of, I feel a lot, I've noticed a change in my mental health just since hearing that. Like, I feel a whole lot lighter and I have more belief in myself. So actually, it shows that environment can really make a difference. That is the main deal, make or break, and always has been for me anyway.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Okay, John Tamman is the last one, and then we're gonna Ian wants to come back quickly. If you have a question, it would be great to hear that as well, John.
Thanks. I just want to make two remarks, really. I think tonight's been really good. Unfortunately, I didn't hear the first part, but no doubt I can listen to it on the YouTube channel. My main point, which I want to make, is that about 3 years ago, must be, I read a book called Affluenza by a clinical psychologist who'd gone around the world to a number of mostly English-speaking countries and interviewed millionaires and multimillionaires and found an enormous degree of psychological problems at that level, as if people in living the capitalist dream and gaining the T-shirt for it as well, they'd won the prize, but found life afterwards completely meaningless. And I think that in effect symbolizes the issue of capitalism accumulating for its own sake, rather than in order to make things for human need, or to make things that will improve the application of science to human problems. I think I'll leave it there. I did want to make a smaller point, but I've forgotten it now.
Okay, I think even rich people suffer from alienation, don't they? Okay, we have one more person wants to come in briefly. Paul, I think we didn't take you last time, and I promised you on Facebook, I think, that we would bring you in today. So here's your chance. All you have to do is unmute yourself, comrade. I've pressed.
I hope you don't mind me speaking, because I'm rather pro-Soviet. I remember that
Let's hear.
in 1900, the life expectancy in Tsarist Russia was about 29 years old. And at the height of, in the 1960s, it had increased to 69 to 70 years. So, and there was free education and free health at the same time. But I know there were mistakes, but that's not the reason I wanted to speak. I wanted to speak as I worked, I wanted to share that I'm rather nervous, so forgive me, that I worked in a children's hospital in Nottingham for the last 16 years and worked in child psychiatry for nearly 40 years, social work and child psychiatry, sorry. And the end of my work, I was working with a group of people, life-threatening illness, but also medically unexplained symptoms. I was seeing increasingly number of children who were having epilepsy or what might have been called pseudo-epilepsy or terrible headaches, terrible pain, and have been being battered about between GPs and paediatricians. As a family therapist, I had drawn from my theory from people like Gregory Bateson, The Steps to the Ecology of the Mind, Irving Goffman, and C. Wright Mills, people who believed in the social imagination and hermeneutics, if you like, rather than a reductionist idea of medicine, really. I'm not disqualifying both the ICD-10 or the DM-5, but certainly I don't like the word disorders, never have done, and living in the liminal world of the dead and dying and painful, where there are no cures, if you like, you tend to go more for a humanistic model.
1 minute, comrade, please. Sorry to rush you along a little bit. 1 minute.
Sorry, 1 minute. So I think the other thing is, I think that is so important for us to unpack that people who have traumas, children who are so damaged by abuse, and also the important point is that neoliberalism has created an enclosed individuality. And as a family therapist, we think about other theorists who realize that the otherness is in us all, and that otherness goes back for generations, and the self is made up of otherness, and we are born into a value systems that that can be completely alien from us. So there's so much to say, really, from the other point of the organic psychiatry. And the last point is that in 1952, homosexuality in DSM-2 was a disorder, and then it got reframed after the pressures of the 60s, and it was taken out in 1972. But resistance to homosexuality remained until 2013.
Thank
There's
you.
So much to say. Sorry.
No. We could only touch on some things in our show tonight, but thank you for joining us. Ian, I think you're going to be our last speaker, and then we're going back to Jackie for next week's program. Oh, you need to unmute again, comrade. Sorry.
Just a couple of little things. So as Marxists, what we're in favour of is the abolition of wage labour. What we're in favour of is the abolition of commodity production. All production is to meet human need. I mean, if you look at the resources, guess who was responsible for starting to close down psychiatric hospitals and sell them off and sell off the land? Enoch Powell in 1961, the same year that Irving Goffman published Asylums. The closure of the asylums, they didn't have a lot of people to defend them. But try now getting your auntie or your mum or whatever into hospital where she's got Alzheimer's disease. You're going to end up selling the house, and that's going to be paid for, despite the fact that that person probably paid in all their lives. Psychiatric hospitals themselves were a particular response. They grew out of the poor law in the Victorian period, well, before the Victorian, but they grew out of the poor laws as a way of separating out those who couldn't work from those who merely didn't have a job. Again, it's a classic example of that, how a society throws up a particular form of medicine. And I totally agree, well, with one aspect about the Soviet Union. Average life expectancy in the Soviet Union declined 10 years in 10 years for men. And the biggest causes of death was from accidents, violence, and poisoning. But also, let's remember, before the Soviet Union had turned into the monstrosity it had become, one of the early acts of the young Soviet Republic was to institute a psychoanalytic institute for the treatment of children traumatized by the Civil War and Revolution. The possibility of socialism is the possibility of the improvement in all health, including mental health, because I draw no distinction. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you very much, Conrad, and thank you for everybody who's contributed to tonight's show. Back to Jackie.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, actually, just a thought that suddenly came into my head, that it's not a coincidence, is it, that the left has been called cranks by the establishment, or that Jeremy Corbyn this week was being bullied by being described as somebody with dementia, because that's what the establishment does, doesn't it? I mean, if you don't agree with whatever they want to come up with, capitalism, you know, the hours you have to work, the pressure you work under, then you must be actually mentally ill. But of course, you know, what's interesting for me about this discussion and looking at what's happened to Black people is because Black people, you know, in many ways, who have been at the brunt of some of the worst consistently that capitalism could throw at you for hundreds of years, having been turned themselves into commodities, having then been abused and alienated from themselves, the attempt to alienate them to themselves so incredibly, have actually found certain ways of maintaining themselves and their mental health. Because of course, what happened to slaves is that they weren't allowed to speak their own languages, they weren't allowed to transmit their own culture. And if you want to kill a people, if you really want to kill a people, then you actually do it by taking away their sense of identity, their sense of history. And of course, what Black people did with that was that they found ways of resisting through the development of their culture. We see this, you know, if you're interested, have a look at W.E.B. Du Bois and the Souls of Black Folks. And he already, only 30 years after slavery, was talking about the way that learning how to use language in creative ways, learning about how to sing and dance to communicate political resistance became something that didn't just save them through their identities, but enabled them to resist. And this resistance took the form of all sorts of creative endeavors. And all resistance has used creativity. That creativity, which in capitalist societies, they try to make only for the elite, an elite which is paid for in huge amounts of money, a creative elite which they can control through their editorial controls. But what Black people found was a way to maintain that sort of creative spirit, even under the most awful oppression, and it resisted that atomization, and they did it. And even today we see it with rap and soul, with rock and roll, with graffiti, with literature, with sculpture, with dance, with dialect, and there it is in every single protest movement now. You see the signs of it, you see how it's there, and how that exuberance of resistance through culture feeds resistance. Well, why am I talking about this? Well, because next week, in the third of the programs, we're going to be talking about revolution and joy, because joy is what capitalism squeezes out of human society, and it's joy that is in itself a revolutionary feeling, and a feeling that if you tap into can give huge energies to resistance. And to do that, I'm going to be talking to Glenn Jenkins. He's a community facilitator who for 20 years has not just been organizing parties and all sorts of community activities. He's politicized thousands, and I mean tens of thousands, as you'll see next week, of young people. He was the member of the Exodus sound system. He knows how to tap into joy for resistance. And even now, he's still organizing that kind of resistance. And for example, he organizes the political tent at the Levelers Music Festival. But along with that, it's going to be a great show next week. We're also going to be having Alexi Sale and Ken Loach talking about the way that art and culture can be used to politically resist what's happening. So don't miss next week. It's going to be a really good one. See you all next week, and thank you very much for coming.